As you can see, things are a little bit different. First of all, we're working with the engine right side up for once. And secondly, I've taken the engine, I've spun it around on the engine stand for the purpose of the video. I've worked this engine stand before with VMAX engines, working from the other side. If that's a problem for you, now's the time to turn it around. Well, the engine's light enough, one person can pick it up, you can spin it around and slide it back on and re-level it or whatever. So, where we're going to go from here, we're going to work with the middle gear and the final drive and talk about lash and how to get rid of the lash and how to set it properly. You don't want to get rid of it totally or you're too tight. So we'll go forward from there. First thing is, Yamaha sells a tool. They sell a tool. You have to lock this shaft up. You have to lock it up. I've decided to just build one of my own. So I have a piece of aluminum, a piece of flat stock. It's as simple as this. And all I'm going to do with this unit is install, as you can see, I removed one of my keeper plates, so we'll be going back to that. All you do is install it. I'm using two of the cover bolt holes. One hole is basically drilled to size, the other hole is extra long, and I'll show you why that is here in a second. So what we're going to do is just snug this in and get on this one. Now the effort is to apply pressure, a downward pressure before I tighten this. What this is doing is forcing that piece of aluminum stock against the flat of the nut, because you don't want that shaft to move or you're going to get a false indication on your dial indicator. So that's it. It's locked. It's moving a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and open it up and put some more pressure on it. It cannot move at all. There, now we're nice and solid. Solid as a rock. So I had my little apparatus installed. The reason one piece is aluminum, one piece is metallic, I needed a piece of metallic because I'm using a magnetic base dial indicator. This whole dial indicator assembly can be bought at a tool supply place, whatever. I don't think I paid $28 for it. And it does work in increments of 1,000, which is what you're going to need. So I'm just going to set this on here. I'm going to line it up. As the manual describes, you want to be on center in two directions. You want to be on center this way on this casting. I'm going to turn my magnet on. And then if you come over here, you want to be on center this way with that pin. That's where they ask you to be in order to take the proper measurement. So we'll get started here. Now obviously the objective is to reduce lash, not eliminate lash. You need a little bit of lash to allow a film build on the gear so their oil remains between the two gear surfaces. So what they're asking for is a tolerance of 5 thousandths or 0.12 mils. So I'm just going to show you where we're at right now, and obviously I have this relaxed a little bit. My shaft's locked, and so as you can see, I've got about 28 thousandths lash in this system right here. Now I've gone ahead and made up my shim pack and tested it for the purpose of the video, or we'd be here for about an hour. Take your time and do this correctly. So I finalized my shim pack. It ended up 0.039 thousandths, or almost a mil, 0.9596 mil. So I've just got the whole pack together. I'm going to sneak it in there. It hooks on the bolts. I'm going to grab my other side. And just to give you an example, I have a heavy shim, a very light shim, a 0.2, and then a heavier one. I put the light one between the two, sandwich it. Doesn't affect the stack up. It protects the shim a little bit, keeps it from getting wrinkled or damaged as you're installing it. So here we go. That whole shim pack's in. I'm going to dart this forward a little bit against my shim pack just to hold it there. Then I'm going to snug my bolts eventually here. And again, you're looking for 5 thousandths lash. This is with dry gears. There's they have not been lubricated, or 0.12 mils. Just making sure everything's in place here, nothing hanging out around the edge. We'll see how we come out here. So I'm just snug. And now what I'm looking to do is to find the lash. Well, there's the bottom, there's the top. And as you can see, I've taken it from 30 thousandths lash down to 5. And what they'll tell you is to err on the high side. If as you're adding shims and you get down to those 0.1 mils and stuff like that, you end up less than 5, go greater than 5. Maybe you're going to end up at 6, but don't go too tight because you'll wear the gears out. Doing this properly eliminates a lot of the whining noise that you hear from the transmission, or people believe it's in their rear end and everything else. Dry gears, I'm at 5 thousandths. Now I'm going to go ahead and torque to the spec of 30 Newton meters and check it again. Just to make sure everything's drawn up. So here we go. I'm exactly 5 thousandths. And you hear that little bit of noise. That's with dry gears. That's allow for a film build on the face of those gears so that you don't have metal to metal contact. And that's what they ask for. Again, very simple way to do it. Make your own tool. I got a magnetic base. This whole thing didn't cost me $30 in material and gauges and everything else. So works out really good. One last item. I forgot to mention it earlier. With no shim packs in, do not draw this flange all the way against this housing, because there's a crush washer inside this spindle assembly. You will cause that crush washer to collapse some more, and then you're going to end up with false readings and your gear is going to be loose later, whatever. Never draw it up until you've got shim in there and you know you're working it from a high scale down to the 5 thousandths. So there you have it, and that'll wrap that up. Well, it's a good thing I go in and check these video clips every once in a while. As we had wrapped up the shimming process and the lash, setting the lash for the final output shaft, there's one thing I recognized that I'd forgot to discuss with you, and that's the installation of the spindle, the yoke and spindle assembly. So, in brief, I'm not going to take it apart and go through all that for you. You've had it out, you know what it looks like. Basically, it's a spindle assembly. It's got an O-ring on it. You want to make sure, 1, you put a new O-ring on it. 2, you lubricate the O-ring. Now, what I had to do, because of the type of locking device I used this flat part of the nut here. Now, by having that locked, and in order to get a 3 o'clock position on this yoke, I found that I had to stab it a couple of times to where it would line up. First time I think I stabbed it, I hit it at 2 o'clock. Next time was 4 o'clock. I found the tooth in between, stabbed it in, and I got my 3 o'clock position. More importantly, and we'll try to get down here and take a look at this for you, there's an arrow. This arrow points up, and that's exactly where you want that arrow on that flange. It's on the bottom, pointing up, pointing to the top. And what we're going to start doing is putting in the associated sub-assemblies that have to go in before the flywheel go on. And one of them happens to be this doohickey. It's a diffuser, I believe. It saddles itself up in here, has a couple of seals on it. You want to inspect the seals. This is a separate piece from this piece. Seal here, seal here. Not exactly sure, but I'm sure it has something to do with diverting oil or working as an oil scraper, whatever. Again, all internal bolts here are prepped with red Loctite. I'm going to hand start a few. I'll flush them out and get back with you here. We're back to our thingamabob here, or this scraper, shield, whatever you want to call it. Again, all the screws have been prepped with red Loctite, and I'm going to use an impact Phillips driver to set them. Another internal fastener that you don't want to come loose and have stuff start flying around and getting all wadded up. I have seen a few of these shields wadded up before. Some friends of mine. Can't explain what happened or why, but they have gotten wadded up. One last thing I want to cover. So we go back to the middle gear cover. We've done all of our shim packing. I've installed both of these. I had to remove this to install my device to do my dial indicator. The last thing we need to do here is stake these bolts. These bolts have to be staked in addition to the red Loctite and the torque spec. So to stake it, I'm just going to try to put a nice good dimple in here and get that to set. It is a requirement. A lot of pressure there. While we're here, I will go after the gear train. So the starter gear train. What I'm going to do, again, to avoid any dry startup, I'm going to wet these two shaft journals with some pre-lubricant. Now this is interesting. Two shafts. First of all, this fine tooth gear is the one that meshes with the starter. It goes on the spline shaft. Spline shaft goes here. There you go. This gear, the boss or the shoulder is equal on both sides. You can flip it one way or the other. Doesn't matter. The next gear is a secondary gear. It's splined also. The bosses are not equal. One side's flush. One side has a shoulder. The shoulder faces out at you. The next gear, simple shaft, no spline. It's going to put it in there. Now this is the gear that will mate with the starter clutch gear. And how you'll know you'll have this right, as you can see, these gears are flush with each other. They're not offset by any drastic amount like that by being installed backwards. Full engagement and they're flush. So this housing's ready for a flywheel. Here we are back with our stator housing. One thing I wanted to talk about real quick on the flywheel, we have our flywheel assembly. This is a late model flywheel, 90 on up. As you can see, it has trigger points all the way around in a single row. If you got one with a double row or two machine cams side by side or at two different positions across this shoulder, that's an older type. It requires the other ECU module. So this being a late model one, we're ready to go with it. I've pre-lubricated the shaft where the starter clutch is going to idle, and we're just going to try to walk this on. Verify our Woodruff keys in place. It is a taper lock, so I'm just going to slide it on slowly, try to find that keyway, and there we have it. And as you can see, I've meshed into my starter gear already. So there you have it. Now, as we talk about widgets and gadgets, I've still never figured this out. I've checked with some reputable people. They tell me it's a oil cooler. This wire in all the later model units goes inside the bolt, and then the whole assembly goes in. What we'll do is flush this out. I'll get set up with the torque and we'll go from there. Our bolt's flushed out. One thing I forgot to mention, there's a heavy steel washer behind it. That's all part of that assembly, including that wire. The requirement is 130 Newton meters or 94 foot-pounds. So they talk about a holdback tool that you can buy from them, etc. I don't have one. I have a good size crescent wrench. And I'm going to go on this hex behind it. Hex is part of the flywheel, not part of the shaft. I'm going to get on that hex, make sure I'm on there good and tight, and start this final torque. And there it is. As you can see, we have it two-spec. Last item we'll talk about before we move on, timing marks. Timing mark 1, timing mark 2. I highlight them red for timing mark 1, black for timing mark 2. You'll see where that comes into play when we start to time our cam shafts. And you're going to be using these, and a quick indicator which timing mark I'm at, because I'm old. I don't like looking through small holes to find a timing mark exactly to determine am I on 1 or 2. This way red is 1, black is 2. Remember that as we go forward. Well, here we are again, back to a little bench work. A couple of things I got laid out here is our clutch slave cylinder, a little rebuild kit, and the neutral switch. I wanted to talk about the neutral switch first. Basically, new O-ring, clean it up. It's only got one contact point in there. I put a little lubrication on the inside because I like that stuff. And I've had to install a new wire. As you can see, this wire here was dry rotted, heat checked, whatever. Could have been from poor routing, exhaust system, whatever. So now's the time to do this. You don't want to fiddle with this and ignore it, because when you get all done, as you're tying in your wiring harness, you're going to want to make sure you got good conductors. Typical slave cylinder. Got your housing, you got your piston, a spring, an outer seal, the inner seal. I've already installed it. It is a little difficult to install. The thing you want to pay attention to is the lip. It's a cup seal. It works in a hydraulic cup seal. So you want the cup, or the open side of the cup, facing backwards or facing this side of the piston. This happens to be the side the spring goes on. So you just work that down on there. I've pre-lubricated it, of course. And we're going to go ahead and lay the piston in there. I use a little tool, try not to score anything. Put some pressure on it. Walk that lip around a couple of times to where it'll drop in. Now I've stopped right there. You can see this second lip. That's this outer seal. The outer seal just goes on there. You want to confirm it's on before you snap it down. So I'm just going to walk around this thing. There you go. It's on all the way around. Push the piston a little farther in, and then start this outer seal. It has a second lip on it that grabs the housing. There you have it. Took less than 5 minutes. You can buy these kits all day long. Last thing I always like to do, I'm going to put in a new bleeder bolt. So I got a little Teflon on there. Just going to put it in. 8mm wrench and set it. Now on the VMAX, I have myself a nice new standoff tube here. On the VMAX, there's a piece that goes in between these two. It's probably still sitting at the bottom of my wash tank, parts cleaner tank, so I'll dig that out later, but you got the idea. And again, banjo bolt, 2 new coppers, and that standoff also has a copper at the base here. We're going to go deep into this cavity here. You can see our push rod sticking through, and the back side of that gland we talked about early on, that gland that works as an oil gland. So what we're lacking here is an oil seal. So what you want to do, get a new oil seal. I've prepped one. I have one here. I'm just going to go ahead and walk it in here, stick it on the rod. I'm going to use the rod to help me, hopefully. And just got it laying on the rod, just as you see it. The next thing I like to do is just push it on with a deep well socket. Now what I've selected here is a 16 millimeter deep well socket. Just going to go ahead and take it right up to the block. And there you have it. Make sure it's flushed out all the way around. So that's your push rod, clutch push rod seal. We're going to go ahead and install the neutral switch. This is the location it goes. This pattern is irregular. It will only go in one way. Again, we've already talked about the switch itself. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and set this in here. Work that new O-ring past the lip. I'm into this seal. Flush with the block. And I'm going to just go ahead and start some bolts for you. As you can see, I'm not using the standard countersunk Phillips. I like to leave my mark somewhere. On the engines I do. This is just one of a few spots. These are nice polished stainless steel. I believe they're 5mm bolts. I've got a little Loctite dressed on all of them, blue, serviceable. The spec calls for 3.5 Newton meters. I don't have a wrench small enough to do that, so I'm gonna use my educated guess at 3.5 here. First I'll just get them all close. And the reason we're doing this now is because what we'll want to go after is the slave cylinder. When we do the slave cylinder, not that this can't be done, but it'll be more difficult. So here we go. 3.5. Click. 3.5. 3.5. Clutch slave cylinder installation. It's going to mount up. Obviously, it's going to swallow this push rod. Mounting bolts are here and here. There's been discussions in the past about these mounting bolts. Do they or do they not need any type of sealant on them because they penetrate an oil cavity? Well, in fact, I've checked them both. They're both blind holes. So I'm going to assume not. I've never used a sealant on these, but there has been discussion about it and concerns people have brought up in the past. Now, the trick to all this is you can't just take this straight in. You actually got to bring it in from the bottom, raise it up into, get over that push rod, raise it into position. I'm going to find the first hole here, see if I can get it started. And I believe I'm halfway started. I'm just going to get it close to where I can swing it around, as you can see. There is some room for forgiveness here. And I'm going to guess at that hole being right there. Try to sneak my second bolt in. I'm hoping the socket clears that housing. I think I got lucky. So there you have it. That's installed on both bolts. I'll flush them out and get back with you. Here we are. Everything's flushed out on the slave cylinder. So I'm just going to go in here. 6mm bolts. I've got them pre-dressed with blue Loctite, serviceable, and 10 Newton meters of torque. There's one. And if I can land on this one, here we go. There you have it. Simple as that. One thing I like to do, depending on the age of the engine and everything else, I go ahead and install a nice new little rubber piece here. Obviously you're all familiar with that for when you're doing your bleeding. So there you have it. I'm just going to leave it tucked back there. Here we are, back at some bench work. Got the stator cover here, typical stator cover. I'm leaving the front out. You'll see why later. So what we got to do is assemble this stator cover. This engine is a late model engine from 1990 beyond, so it only has a single crank trigger in it. But first thing to do is start to work with the stator itself. Stator goes in first, in my opinion. What we got to do, these grommets, these rubber grommets are going to make or break you for an oil leak. So if they're bad, you're going to have to get rid of them and get some new ones. I hear you can buy them at like an alternator rebuild shop, places like that. Yamaha doesn't sell. They only sell this with the whole stator. So we're going to go back to the old Yamaha Bond number 5. Nice messy stuff. Please feel liberal to use a lot on here. And what I'm doing is putting this between the ribs on this grommet. Just going to load it in there. It's going to be a little messy. That's okay. Stator, I'm going to flip it over. Just going to lay it down in there. Temporarily set it because it's more important that I get this set first. And there we go. And it's okay to have it goopy and excess material because this is one thing you don't want to have an oil leak from. Now, going on to the stator itself, there's a routing. I think I'm close right there. There's a routing for this cable. Just like that. You want it to land between those two pins because you got a shield that goes on afterwards. Grommet's in place. Cable all the way to the inside of the cover and through this cavity right here. Has to be that way or it's going to get tore up. You're going to have problems. So next thing is just the retainer ring for the stator. All the bolts in the stator, they're internal. All the bolts have been prepped with red Loctite. It's not something you want coming apart. So what I'll do, I'm going to flush these out and get them ready, and then get back with you. We have our stator in place, our retainer ring, and our 3 bolts flushed out with red Loctite. Now I'm going to drive them in with a impact driver, Phillips impact driver. Just like before, clockwise pressure, rotational pressure. We'll go around one more time. Want to make sure these puppies don't come loose. That stator comes loose, gets caught up in the flywheel, and you got problems. There you have it. The stator's installed. Again, this grommet's loaded up with Yamabond number 5. Now we'll move on to the pickup. Like I said, it's a late model bike, late model engine, and it uses a single pickup. Once again, you got to get messy. At least I get messy. Load this thing up with some Yamabond right inside the cavity of this grommet. Grommets have all been inspected, wiring's all inspected, looks good. I'm comfortable putting it in and making an educated guess it's going to run. So I flip it over, let that stuff just ooze out everywhere. And now, this cable goes in behind that boss, comes right out 90 degrees behind that boss, tucks down in there. Next to go down is one of the screws. There's 3 screws here. 1, 2, 3. Other one holds a shield and also a cable shield. This particular one is by itself. It's only dedicated to purpose is to hold on to this pickup coil. Before we can put any of the other 2 screws in, we have a shield that has to go in. As we talked about, these 2 bosses, these 2 little bosses down here, well, this shield that I have right here, you can see it's got 2 holes in it. It's got to land on those bosses, and everything else will line up. It's to hold that cable in and prevent it from getting internal to the housing. So there we go. Now I can put the other screw in with a washer on it, by the way. The first one had a washer, this one has a washer. I'll explain why the last one doesn't have a washer in a minute. I'm going to leave that loose for a moment. Push my grommet down again. Let it ooze out. Last but not least, another cable holder. This cable helps secure or protect this little cable bracket. Helps secure or protect the trigger cable or the pickup coil cable. And this is the one screw out of these 3, set of 3, that doesn't have a washer, because all the stack up you got here. Stack up goes pickup coil bracket, shield bracket, second shield bracket. And I'm just going to confirm that, and that's exactly what we have. So once again, Phillips driver, we're inside the engine. It's something you don't want to come loose. They've all been dressed in red Loctite. And we're going to drive them home. So other than a little bit of ooze out, which is what we want, this stator cover is now ready for installation. Well, here we go. We're wrapping up this side of the engine. As you can see, we recently installed the neutral switch, the slave cylinder, all the associated hardware. I did locate my standoff. I got my hydraulic tube installed. Everything's ready to go and button up. What has to happen next is the stator cover has to go on. The stator cover has to go on before the middle gear cover. one thing you're going to want to do is prep this shaft with a little bit of engine lubricant, just again to keep it dry. Dowel pin, dowel pin. We also have a dowel pin here for the middle gear cover. So, I'll grab the stator cover. What you have to be careful here is, now that the flywheel's on, there's a magnet inside the flywheel, it's going to grab this stator cover. You don't want to get your skin or your finger between the cover and the block. So just try to guide it on, and it's going to be a little difficult. Try to assume or poise the bolt pattern. Get it to locate on the dowels and the shafts. There you go. And the reason this has to go on first is you can see the wiring's in the way. If that middle gear cover was on, you'd never get that in without damaging those wires. Stator has to go in first. All 11 bolts on the stator cover are the same length. It's a torque requirement of 10 Newton meters. So, I'm going to start at the bottom with a little bit of a crisscross pattern. So here we go. 1, and I'm going to jump up here. 2. I'm going to go to the center bottom. 3. 4. I'm going to go 5, 6, 7, 8. We're going to go 9, 10, and this one by itself. And there you have it. And again, just like before, I'll run around that pattern, make sure everything's holding. No sense in showing you that again. You'd seen it. Stator cover's done, torque pattern's done. Just got the wiring loose laid in here. Want to keep it a little loose, and as we go on later, I'll show you how we dress out this entire harness once all the wiring's in. Middle gear cover. Everything's buttoned up, everything's been staked, torqued. 2 dowel pins, one here, one here. The only thing I pre-lubricate is the shifter shaft right on the end here, because it has a bushing in the side of the middle gear cover that you want to try to keep it a little bit wet and lubricated. So here we go. Let's put it on the shaft, locate it on the dowels, try to find that. Now the thing you got to keep track of, 4 bolts, 1, 2, 3, 4. These 4 are the same length. These 2 are extra long because of your shift lever bracket. But what's different? This bolt here, this is a drain cavity for that middle gear cover. You want to make sure, and I don't know if you can pick up on this, you want to make sure you use a copper gasket, brand new copper gasket. So I'm going to put that one in first since it's critical. And as you can see, my preference is to use a little bit of Loctite. Got our middle gear cover on. Here's that bracket I was talking about. These 2 bolts are longer than the other 4. The critical bolt is this one right here. It's got the copper washer on it, because that's used to drain this middle gear cover. So everything's fleshed out, ready to go. I'm just going to do, again, a crisscross pattern. 10 Newton meters. Here's 1. Here's 2. Here's 3. Here's 4. 5. And 6. Now that we've buttoned up both sides of our engine, we need to start putting together the center of the engine and then move on to the cylinder heads. So the first thing I want to talk about is the breather housing. Typical breather housing has a lot of functions. It's an oil delivery system for the cylinder heads. We'll get into that. It's also a water manifold. It's a venting manifold, and functions in one cavity as a drain back to the crankcase. So as we talk about oil delivery to the cylinder heads, I'm going to try to point this out to you. Don't know if you'll pick it up or not. There's a bore right here inside the block. That is a delivery point that's going to come off of our oil pump system, the pressure side, and deliver oil to the cylinder head. So this intermediate tube goes right in there. And what I want to show you is make sure you put new O-rings on this, because this is the pressure side. Any leaks here is going to diminish or affect your oil pressure delivery to the heads. Brand new gasket on the breather housing, and like I said, it has a few functions. It handles some of the water, it handles the venting, the draining, and oil pressure. So what you want to do, there's no dowel pins, it's just a bolt pattern and this rod, this coupling here. So what we're going to do is try to land this right on top of that. And there we go. So what I'll do, I'll throw a couple of bolts in. It's installed, it's flushed out. Don't forget about that oil delivery tube that goes right under this section right here. Make sure it's got new O-rings on it. This has new gaskets on it. Again, 6mm bolts. Just going to use a cross pattern here. So it's a 10 Newton meter torque. There's one. Two. This one's a little tough to get at. 3, 4, 5, 6. One thing I want to mention before we move on. The reason we're installing this now is next thing we'll go after is the cylinder heads, the studs, put the heads on, and the cam chain tensioner that goes here. You cannot get this in, or it's very difficult to get in once that tensioner is in place. So now's the time to do it and get it done and over with. So now it's time to start talking about cylinder heads and cylinder head assembly. So what I have here is a pair of cylinder heads for the engine we're going to be assembling. They're in body position or in their respective positions. Again, left side of the engine, right side of the engine, on the rider, rear cylinder bank, front cylinder bank. Cylinder 1, 3, cylinder 2, 4. A lot of people are under the impression these heads are the same and can interchange, when in fact they're probably from the same casting, but they can't interchange. Exhaust side, front cylinder bank, intake side. There is the cam tensioner machined opening. That on the front head faces the intake side. Go to the rear cylinder bank, intake side, no tensioner. Tensioner's on the exhaust side. That's the only difference you'll find in these heads, front to rear, along with water hose connections. Another thing I like to do, in order to keep track of all the internal components of the head, I use an inexpensive little fishing tackle box, I think it is, and put the dividers in as I see fit. I have an arrow that indicates forward position of the bike, the cylinder numbers 1 and 3 from engine set 1, in case I'm doing multiple engines. Very easy way to keep track of everything. And again, I'm going to hold it in body position. This cam cap, here belong to that head, all on the all on the intake side. These cam caps belong to the rear side of the head. We're going to get into that later because they're also identified by Yamaha. Keep track of each valve, and keep track of each spring set, retainers, etc. and so on. It's a good way to keep everything organized while it's disassembled and when you're going to need it for reassembly. So what we're going to do next is start with the cylinder head and start installing valves. We're going to install the valve train. We'll get to that in a minute. Tools I believe are needed: set a long nose hemostat, little 1/4 inch driver, have an 8mm deep well socket on there. You'll see how that comes into play. Valve spring compression tool, very inexpensive, not too costly at all. It's all manual, nothing fancy. Keep the cost down. Now, we go over to the bench. Don't mind the mess. I've got a lot of little projects going. Here's your typical valve train assembly, in order of assembly, for any given valve in a set of heads for Yamaha VMAX. Got your valve. This happens to be an exhaust valve. Got your spring seat. This is on the bottom or internal side. You'll see it with the 2 shoulders, one for the outer spring, one for the inner spring. Viton positive valve seal, good brand. Inner spring, outer spring, spring retainer. Again, it's got the steps for the inner and outer spring. Keep them centered. Set of keepers. What's critical here is the spring color code. Don't know if the camera picks it up or not. It's kind of a turquoise, bluish turquoise, both springs. First of all, in assembly, that color must face up. and the color represents the strength of the spring. So I'll get, another thing I like to do, because the heads have been machined, I keep a nice soft surface so that when I'm working with the head and I'm moving it around, I'm not scraping up the bottom side, the gasket side, or causing any damage. Okay, what we're going to do now is go ahead and assemble a valve into the head, and this is a process that you just repeat throughout all 16 of them. So the first thing I like to do is install the valve spring seat. And I just take it, I put this in first before I put the valve seal in. This allows this to load a little easier over the valve guide. Make sure it's in, all the way down, and the steps we spoke of earlier in the valve seat, spring seat, are facing upward. Next, we're going to do the valve seal. I've pre-lubricated this, again with a little bit of engine assembly lube for the purpose of protecting it while the engine first starts up. What I do is locate it over the top of the guide, push down on it gently. This is where the 8mm socket comes into play. It's the right size, just sit right over the top of it without damaging the lip. Bump it a little bit, make sure she's seated all the way down. Feels good there. We're going to wet the stem down of the valve. Again, so nothing's dry when the engine starts up. Also work some of this lubricant towards the groove for the keepers. It'll assist in holding the keeper while we're putting the second one in. Going with the first exhaust valve of this cylinder head from my kit. Just locate it. Push it in slowly. I can feel the seal. I can feel the groove pass through the seal, and then rest it the way up. That seal has got enough retention on it to hold the valve in. You don't have to worry about it dropping out. Next thing we're going to do is load the springs. Again, we talked about the color. We talked about the color has to face up. Another reason for that is, as you can see, the spring's designed with more preload at one end than the other. And that's part of the design to help the springs mechanically function correctly. Again, color up. There we go. Inner spring's in, it's on its own shoulder. Outer spring's in, it's on its own shoulder. The spring retainer, got the same steps as we talked about. Just want to make sure it's centered under the inner spring and the outer spring. We'll take our spring compression tool, load it over the spring stack. The bottom is center of the valve. It's a ball type, so it's somewhat self-centering. Just feel around. It'll find the low spot in the valve. And then just gently compress the spring to expose the groove on the valve stem and enough room to put your keepers in. So I think that should be about enough room. If not, we'll adjust it some more. I added to the tools we talked about earlier. I went and picked up a screwdriver also. I think we're going to need it. Now on to the fun job of the keepers. I've worked with guys that are able to pop these things in, and then there's guys like me. Takes a couple of tries. I'm just going to lay it in there, get it close to the groove, and install it onto the stem. One thing I meant to talk about before I put that one in, we'll talk about it here on the second one. The keeper is a taper. It's fat at the top, thin at the bottom. Works like a wedge. Needs to be installed that way so that you have the proper locking effect for the spring, still leaving the top of the valve stem exposed for your lift or your shim bucket. And I'm going to try to rotate that around slightly. It's staying in position. Make sure it's all the way against the valve stem. It is. Looks like it'll leave me enough room for the second one. This process is just going to be repeated over and over. Again, I'm loading my little hemostat here. Paying attention to the taper. Thin on the bottom, fat on the top. Got it where I want it. Get it close to the groove. As soon as I think I'm close, take the screwdriver, help support it as I remove the hemostat. And there you have it. I don't know if you can get a shot of that. There's both keepers in. So now I'm going to go ahead and start relaxing the spring stack and being careful that I stay center so that those tapers lock in as the spring retainer comes back to its normal position. And as you can see, everything's still in position, and away you go. I'm going to open the tool all the way before I try to extract it or bring it out so I don't drag across the surface, those machine surfaces on the heads. So there's one complete valve assembly in the head. And what we're going to do now is repeat this process 7 more times on this head, 8 times on the other head. When I get to the last one, I'll see you again. So now we're back to the bench work, and hopefully you got all your valves done. So the first thing we're going to do next, after all the valves are installed, I've devised my own method to elevate the head. So I'm just using a couple of pieces of aluminum. You can use a couple pieces of wood, whatever it takes. Because the next little process is it is required and recommended by the manual. I'm just again putting something over it to protect the surfaces. So here's my finished head, second finished head. Did the other one. This happens to be the front cylinder head. Again, body position, left side, right side. And so what's recommended by the manual is that you bounce these valves a little bit. I'm using a piece of brass, something soft, something that's not going to damage anything or nick the valve stem. And you just give it a couple little bounces, and that helps make sure all the keepers are seated. And you go through that process front and rear set of valves. So I did jump ahead of you a little bit. I went ahead and installed my dowels. I loose laid them all in, because the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you my method of installing the shim buckets, and then we're going to go through a bench shim process, and that gets rather interesting. And then we'll also talk about the cam caps and the identifying of left to right and everything else. So first thing we're going to do, I'm going to grab a typical shim bucket and oil it down a little bit. I put my oil in a little container so I didn't have to divulge what brand of oil I use. Make you guys wonder. Why am I using oil instead of the engine lube? Because I don't want the valve train, as we talk about the shim buckets, to become so gummy and sticky that on initial startup we have a problem. So I just use the motor oil. And I'm going to just install a couple of these, and then I'll get back with you. So we're going to continue on with the cylinder head assembly. As you can see, our kit's getting lower and lower. That's a good sign. We're getting things done. Like I said, I jumped ahead of you. I did install the dowels. We just put in the shim buckets. And if you kept track of your shim buckets, as you did everything else, you just want to drop them back in their respected locations. The shims are going to require to be reshimmed depending on the type of machining, valve work you had done, etc. So let's talk about the caps. Let me back up. We're going to talk about the cam selection. We need a cam before we need caps. So, typical VMAX camshafts, they're labeled IN or EX. EX for exhaust. Now, I'm going to call it a thrust flange. There's a thrust flange at each end and the sprocket. These have not been disassembled. There was no reason to disassemble them. I'm working with body position, front cylinder head, cylinders 2, 4, intake to the center of the engine, and so I'm dealing with the front cylinder head. Don't know if the camera will pick this up or not. Labeled front. Same thing with this exhaust cam. As soon as I find it, it's labeled front. What that means is it's the front cylinder head, not the very front cam. So, we're just going to go ahead. We know we got our front pair. Now I'm just looking for the in for intake. Flange end. pay attention to this, because everything else I told you about engine left, right, and all that is going to go away for a little bit. So, my shim buckets are in with an approximate shim size. I've got my flange seated, my thrust flange seated in the machined opening for it. As we talk about cam caps, and we talk about how Yamaha also has identified them, they look at every cylinder head from left to right, regardless if it's the front or the rear. How they do that is this flange. This flange on the left side, we're going to count 1, 2, 3, 4. On the exhaust side, same flange, 1, 2, 3, 4. How do we know that? I'm going to dump these bolts out for a second. Again, this is going to be really difficult for the camera to see. There is actually, how about that? There is actually a stamp, I1, port side. Port side, so the stamp goes to the port side. Intake, I. 1, 2, 3, 4. This one belongs here. It's the only place you ever want it to reside, because this end-line bore is done with the caps assembled, torque down, no cam, they do the bore. For instance, just going to show you an example of the exhaust side. Again, flange, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we're talking intake port side, now we're talking exhaust port side. So as this is in its proper position, now the stamp is on the port side. And it should say E4. I can see it, hopefully you can. I'm half blind. So, if I was working with the rear head, I would spin it around in this exact orientation, spin it around backwards. So this is the time we ignore everything I've said about the left side, right side of the engine. Spin it around. So this flange, this thrust flange, is on your left-hand side. And all the caps go 1, 2, 3, 4. Port side, exhaust 1, exhaust 2, exhaust 3, exhaust 4 stamping. Intake side, I1, I2, I3, I4. And so we're just going to set these things in, and next we're going to start a little bench shimming. This is a technique that was shared with me by a very respected engine builder out of New York. We're not going to go into any brands and names, but the guy's been more than helpful. And he's shared with me a method in doing what's called bench shimming before the head's even installed on the engine. I've done about 4 sets that way, and I'll tell you I'm batting at least 500 where I haven't had to go back and make any shim adjustments after the head's torqued to the block. So, we're just going to go ahead and throw this in and take some measurements. I'm going to go ahead and just start here. I'm not using any Loctite, anything else. I'm just going to run this down snug, because all of this gets disassembled again in order to install the head onto the block, bring the cam chains through, and so on and so on. And you'll get an opportunity to see all of that. So we're dealing with the intake side, intake valves, 4 to 7 thousandths is the range, 5, 5.5 is nominal. I like to use 6, so I use 6 thousandths, keeping in mind the intake valves tighten, exhaust valves grow loose. I happen to have set up for myself here, I've separated the feeler gauges, 4, 5, 6, 7. I like to use 6. So we're going to find out where we're at here. And of course I got plenty of room. I'm going to go to my no-go gauge. I call it 7. 7 is my no-go. If it fits, then I've got work to do, and I do. Here we are wrapping it up on our bench shimming project. So I believe I'm down to my last issue. Again, as I talk about the intake side, I like to use 6 thousandths, a tight 6 thousandths. For clearance, 7 thousandths as a no-go. So I'll just show you an issue I got here going, and then how we're going to correct it, and then move on from there. So here's my 6 thousandths, and what I'll try to do here is show you that it passes. I bump up to my 7 thousandths, which I'm using as a no-go gauge, and I'm no-go, I'm go. So we're going to make one more change on this shim and try to add about 1 thousandths, 1.5 thousandths to it to tighten up that gap and get our no-go to function so everything's equal across the board. This bench shimming process is again something that's going to save us a lot of time later on, and make life a lot easier. But I will share with you how to do it once the engine's fully assembled, also using the Yamaha shim removal tool. So this is the guy giving me a little bit of trouble. Look at it. It's a number 268. I'm going to bump it up to a 272. And again, that should add a little over a thousandths. Tighten it up by that. Again, we're paying attention to this flange end. It's critical. And port side, so I'm looking for all my stamps on my port side. Intake, 1, 2, I'm holding number 3. I'm going to put in 3 and 4. Test it. Things look good. We'll pop in 1 and 2. Run you through a quick check. And go from there. And here's number 4. Again, I haven't bothered to use any kind of a pre-lubricant and stuff like that, due to the fact that all of this has to come apart again once to install the heads onto the block and to install the cam chains, etc. We'll go through that fun process as it comes up. So I'm going back to my 6 thousandths, perpendicular or 180 degrees from the shim is my lobe. Here's my 6. Here's my 6. Like I said, I like a tight 6. I'm going to go up to 7 thousandths here as soon as I can find it. 6, 7. Make sure, got it. I got a no-go, and now I got a no-go. So that solves that last adjustment I had on this head here. Now I'm looking at I2. Again, 1, 2 from that flange side. Only one left, but I1, just double checking, make sure I don't get something mixed up here. They all look the same. It's easy to do. Just snugging these cam caps down to flush them out. They're obviously not at torque yet, but they are flush. And there we go. So, we'll just double check ourselves. Again, my lobe is 100 opposite my shim. Here's my 6. Here's my 6. I'm gonna bump it up to 7 here. No go, no go. We just did these, no go, no go. So I'm happy with that. Again, we'll quickly talk about the exhaust settings. This head's done. And I like to use 10 as a go, 11 as a no-go. There's my 10, there's my 10, there's my 10, there's my 10. Here comes my 11. No go, no go, no go, no go. Intake valves, as the engine runs and gets time and hours on it, miles, the intake valves tighten. Exhaust valves will slightly loosen. So keep that in mind, and we'll go from there. One last thing I want to show you, again, just talking about these 2 flange sizes, I1, 2, 3, 4, exhaust 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to show you how that correlates back to the other head. I'm going to slide this guy up here. Bring the other head up. Just go over it one more time and we'll have this wrapped up. Okay. Here's my rear head. I have these heads in body position, bike position. Forward of the bike, left side of the engine, right side of the engine. My intake facing center, intake facing center, front head, intake facing center, intake facing center. As we talked about this flange being critical, well now these flanges are over here. This is why I believe Yamaha actually takes these heads in their assembly process. They travel through their process in this manner. Now everything is 1, 2, 3, 4. Just a matter if you're dealing with the intake port or the exhaust port. Flip it back this way. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4 in that set. Well, here we are, getting ready to install the cylinder heads. So a couple of things you're going to want to have prepared and ready before you start this task is make sure you got all your studs prepped and cleaned or replaced. Got all my head bolts, all my head bolt washers, my dowel pins. I got the timing tensioners out here for the moment. Don't really need those to install the heads right away. The cam chain dampeners and chain guides. The other thing you want to have ready are these crossover manifolds for the coolant. Now, some of you may be lucky and you're able to extract these things without damaging them. I haven't been able to do that yet, so I always end up replacing them. But definitely, you want to have a new set of O-rings for it, your drive pins that lock it in. In addition, obviously, is the head gaskets. We've got to have the head gaskets ready. First thing we're going to do is install the timing chain dampener. Now, there's a dampener and there's a guide, so let's talk about the dampener. The dampener is the one that functions with the tensioner. So this has to go in before the cylinder head can go on. As you can see, way down in this cavity, there's the bracket this needs to land on. So all you got to do, slide it down. As you can see, I pushed my chain out of the way. And then you'll see it seats right there. So that's it. Now, here we are on the other side, again with the dampener. The dampener is the one that functions with the tensioner. So we have a tensioner coming in from the back side of the rear cylinder head. We have a tensioner coming in from the front, I'll call it the back side of the front cylinder head. It's right here. So, all we're going to do, I'm going to keep it along that surface. You will feel this snap into that bracket, and that's it, right there. Just snaps in. Again, I'm flushed out. Next thing to install is our dowels. The cylinder heads have to have dowels. So it's the 4 large dowels. 2 in the rear, 2 in the front. And you just want to make sure they're seated, they're down so they don't hold up the head. And that's pretty much it right there. Here we are with one of 16 head bolt studs that has to be installed. You're going to find there's a long threaded end and a short threaded end. Long threaded end to the block. Now the torque spec on this, they're really just looking to have you bottom it out in the threads. It's 9 Newton meters. So I'm just going to pick one here since we got 16 to do. Get it started, and I'll show you a little technique I use to drive them in. I have, and you saw it over there when we had the parts laid out, I have a 10 millimeter nut, threaded nut. I put it on as a jam nut. Then I'm going to take a head bolt, put it on. I'll grab a Allen wrench and a 17 millimeter open end wrench just to create the jamming condition, and then I'm just going to walk this thing in until I feel it bottom out. I'll switch to my torque wrench, which is set to 9 Newton meters. Again, all they're looking for is to have you bottom this out. And that's it right there. So we got 15 more to do. When I get those done, we'll get back with you. A couple items I wanted to cover before we go any farther. As you can see, we got all our studs in. I think I found a method that's going to work for you. As it relates to the chain, I should have done it right from the beginning. This dampener does have to be in before the head, so I'm just taking the chain, wrapping it around, tucking it back inside, and letting the other weight of the chain hold itself, because this one we're going to have to lift out of the way as we install the head. This one obviously favors the position for us. Going back to the studs. I've looked at these studs as far as part numbers. There's certain model years. You'll see a different part number for these 4 than the outer 4. Same thing here and here, depending on what model year you look at. Then you go up a few model years and they're all the same part number again. I have yet to find a difference from this stud to this stud. I've compared them. I've done thread depth checks and stuff like that. As we talk about depth, though, I want to confirm that we have seated properly. We've got them at 9 Newton meters. And I've just set my depth gauge for 62 mils. So you don't want anything sticking above 62 mils. They should all be 62 or less. And as you can see, everything here is in its respected position as it was intended. So we'll go forward from here. Here we are, ready to throw some head gaskets on. A couple of the last things you want to confirm: make sure your dowel pins are in place, all four. Your surfaces are clean, not oiled or anything else. They're just dry and clean, because Yamaha stock head gaskets have a coating on them that require no sealant. So the only thing you got to be careful on the head gaskets, they're labeled head. One side's labeled head, the other side's blank. So you want the one labeled head facing towards the cylinder head. So I'm going to go ahead, pay attention to the large holes for the dowel pins. I'm just going to sneak this puppy on here, drop it over the dowel pin, and there you have it. There's that head gasket. I'm going to grab the second one. It's labeled head. There's my large dowel holes. Now here I want to be a little careful, because this chain will want to drop off that dampener. I'm just going to lay it on there, and I let it drop all the way seated onto the dowel pins. One last thing we're going to do before we actually set a cylinder head. I brought over my magic bottle of oil, and it's just motor oil. You do have to put oil on these threads for the head bolts. They want them lubricated. So our dowels are still in place and are labeled. That's important. Facing the head. This one's facing the head. So I'm going to go with this one first. It's the easiest one to remember. Front cylinder head. Remember, the front cylinder head has the cam chain tensioner machined opening facing the center of the engine. So again, my surfaces are clean. Everything's ready. Just going to drop this on here. Try not to tear up, get it lined up so I don't tear up any machine surfaces. And there you go. So here we are, ready to install the rear head. Going to go over it again. Dowel pins are in place. Head gasket label saying the word head is facing up towards the head. All my studs, all my threads have been lubricated with motor oil. This one might be a little fussy because we're dealing with this cam chain tensioner dampener. I think what's going to happen here, I'm hoping, just going to try to line it up. Again, eyeball all the studs in so I don't tear anything up. Slightly lean forward on that tensioner bracket and just let the whole thing go down. So there you have it. Now what we'll do, I brought over a couple of bolts and a couple of washers. Very important. You've got to make sure these washers go in and they're seated. So I'm just going to throw a couple in for you. They're seated. I'm going to drop my nuts in. And what we'll do is I'll run those all down, get them flush. Not our heads are in place. All of our head bolts, all of our washers are installed and confirmed before I put on any of the nuts for the head bolts. All the head bolts are in and flushed out. So now the pattern is going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that's what we'll do. It's at 43 Newton meters or 31 foot-pounds. So here we go. Just going to snug it. Now I'm going to go for torque. There's one. There's 2. 3. 4. 5. 6. 7. 8. And that's the pattern. You'll use that same pattern on the front cylinder head and just torque it down, check yourself. Remember the studs, the threads on the studs have been lubricated, and go from there. Next thing we want to do is install the coolant crossover tubes. That's what these are. I just wanted to give you an example. Again, you always want to make sure you use new O-rings. In my case, I've never gotten these out without destroying them, so they're new also. Largest O-ring goes to this side, or we'll call it this installation side. Middle size O-ring goes to the middle, smallest O-ring goes to the very end. And this is, I'm going to prep this other one, and then we'll head over and sneak it through our cam chains and go from there. Our coolant crossover manifolds, tubes, whatever you want to call them. A couple things you need to be aware of before we install them. We've already prepped them. The O-rings are in progressive sizes. There's a window. See that window? That window has to face down or face down towards the cylinder head, the combustion chamber. There's also a notch here. This is the notch. It's an allowable notch for the drive pin that's going to go in. So keep in mind, this unit's going to install this way through our cam chain, which we're going to suspend. So first thing, call it hokey, whatever. I have one set of dedicated pliers with these stupid little flats welded on the end, and this is all I think I ever use them for. So I'm going to use this to hold on to my manifold. It's taped on the side so that I don't like to chew up any paint or anything like that. Next thing I'm going to do is try to grab this chain. So I'm going to set this down and get control of the chain first, because now we have to complicate it. We have to make sure that the chain, that this crossover tube mounts between the chain, or the chain saddles it, straddles it, however you want to say it. So here we go. I'm just going to go right in. It's a progressive fit. As you can see, I'm getting close. And that's it right there. Now I'm going to make sure that notch, I can get my pliers off. One last thing I want to check. Make sure that that notch is lined up so that I can do my drive pin. And that's what I'll be doing next. So we're ready to put in our drive pin. Obviously the drive pin is going to go through this opening right here. First thing I like to do, good practice, I just put some paper towel in there in case I drop this pin. You never know what will happen. So let's look at the end of this crossover tube. As you can see, there's a notch at the top allowing that pin to come through, and then it's going to continue on down into this area here to kind of lock it to keep it from spinning. One thing I didn't show you in the last little clip was you got to push that all the way in. That is now seated. If you see this much exposure of the cylinder head. So let's give this a try. I just load the pin. It's a new drive pin. Don't try to use your old ones. It's a split pin, so it's got some expansion qualities about it. It's going to load it over the hole, get it started, take my unit off there. I couldn't find a drift, so I'm going to use a 1/4 inch extension. All I'm doing, driving it down, flush. There you go. So I'm flush on the top. If we look back in the end, you will see how that pin has now gone through and locked itself into that coolant crossover tube. And then just do the same for the front. As you recall, when we were installing the flywheel, we marked our timing marks. Red for timing mark 1, black for timing mark 2. I don't know if you can pick this up or not, but I'm looking through the stator cover, and as you can see, there's my red mark. It's lined up with the dart that's located on the cover. I'm straight across. So what you want to do is we're in timing mark position 1 and do not move the crankshaft. When timing the camshafts for a VMAX engine, you must time cylinder 1 first, or the rear bank. Top dead center, cylinder 1, the rear bank. Intake, exhaust. We've been through this with our cylinder head assembly and shimming process. Now what I'm going to show you, I'm holding here is the rear intake cam. You can see that dot right there. That is the large dot. Ignore it for the rear cylinder head. I'm going to roll around. You'll find a much smaller dot. I highlighted it in red. There it is. That is the red that's going to be used to time this camshaft for top dead center position 1. So here we are. Rear cylinder head. Crankshaft's at timing mark number 1. Top dead center number 1. So first thing I'm going to do is install the intake cam for the rear cylinder head. And again, we've already talked about the large and small dots. So my effort here is to just get this close. I'm going to try to locate it and even mesh it where I think it's going to approximately be right. It looks like I'm off by one there. Come up to the next mark. If you pay attention to that, I've got that pointing straight out at us. Now they'll tell you to put the caps in first and everything else. I like to fight with it and do it my way, which may not work, may or may not work here. So what I'm going to do now is try to mesh the rear. The whole time I'm keeping tension on the chain, pulling it up this way so that it's tight between the crankshaft and the first intake cam. Now obviously if I snug that off, my timing mark isn't exactly where I want it. So I'm gonna try to skip this ahead a little bit. Probably went too far there. Yeah, you know what? That might be right too. So we're gonna take a look at that. I'm gonna apply pressure on my tensioner, just as if my tensioner was in place. I may or may not have this one yet. Now you can see I got the camshafts in with the chain. I'm maintaining pressure so that I have full tension between the crankshaft and this sprocket. I believe I have it approximately correct. We'll find out after we install some caps. But before I do that, I want to throw a little lubricant on here. Protect everything. They tell you use motor oil. I use motor oil on the valve train, or on the shim buckets. But I really like this stuff and it's the way I am. Now, I'm going to install cap number 1 from our kit, I1, for the rear head. And again, just trying to maintain that pressure. I'm going to skip I2 for a good reason. I'll install this I3. Let's get it orientated right here. And that's going to be enough to hold me for what I'm attempting to do here. And again, you kind of got to work one-handed. So what I'll do is try to hand start these a little bit. These bolts have all been pre-lubricated, no Loctite. And we're just going to snug them down because this timing mark position 1 begins applying pressure from the cam to the valve train. So it wants to spring back on me. That's why you see me just really holding on to it here. I might even throw a wrench on it. I believe it's 22 millimeters. I can grab the hex of this cam. So I'll snug these out and get right back with you. I have cap 1 and cap 3 flushed out. Still maintaining that mesh position. I believe I'm really close. I don't know if you can see this or not. This red mark. So I'm going to go ahead and, again, this is trying to push back on me. I went ahead and grabbed myself a 22 millimeter wrench. Just going to bring it down, hook it again. Now I'm pulling full tension against that crankshaft. My chain is tight from here to the crankshaft, and my timing marks are lined up. And hopefully you can see that. And because I'm lazy, I'm just going to let this go and relax against the housing. It ain't going nowhere. Now going to the exhaust cam. Again, I have a red mark for the small dot on the rear cylinder heads. And I'm going to go ahead and bring this timing mark in line. I'm going to guess that we are meshed properly, but we'll find out after we put the cap on. So I'm going to put caps 1 and 3 of E rear cylinder head. And again, I've highlighted number 1 with a red ink right on the timing mark for the purpose of the video. And we're going to throw this guy in. How about if I put a little lubricant on here? See? You didn't catch that. I did. The bolts have been pre-lubricated, but I want to make sure, again, we protect these cam bearings. Just going to use my goopy stuff here. So here we go. E1 of the rear head kit. I'm going to go E3 of the rear head kit. These won't take but a minute to flush out, and then we'll be able to test our timing mark. The cap bolts are lubricated, motor oil just as prescribed, no Loctite, nothing else. Okay, I'm flushed out a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and line up timing mark 1, take all the tension out of my chain between here and the crankshaft, and as you can see, the rear exhaust timing mark is also lined up. So my mesh points on these two sprockets are correct, and there you have it. So what I'll do now is install the rest of the caps, and we'll go over a little torque spec here. We have all our cam caps in place, flushed out, with the exception of 2 bolts, this one and this one. Reason being, we got this little bridge or chain guide to go in. So we're going to go in there. And if you happen to take a look at our kit, you'll see that we finally have emptied the first kit. That's a good sign. We've gotten a lot done, been a lot going on. So once again, I'm going to maintain tension. I'm letting my wrench do a lot of the work. I just wanted you to get a view of what this looks like. There I am, fully tight. The cam chain is tight between the crankshaft and the intake cam and across the bridge to the exhaust cam. And as you can see, everything lines up on the red marks. So what we'll do now, I'm just going to let that wrench sit there, doing some work for me. Cam caps, 6mm, it's lubricated only, motor oil, 10 Newton meters. So we'll try to do a little crisscross pattern with each cap as a whole cap. So I'm going to start with this cap, snug, snug, come back, hit my 10 Newton meters. There it is. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to jump out here. Grab this last cap. Do the same thing for the intake cam here. Basically just working this shaft and the bearings from the center out. Here's all the associated pieces with a typical cam chain tensioner. You got your main housing, and you want to make sure, check it for functionality. I'm just going to push that out. It's a ratchet, so it locks. If yours are extended, release the lock, push it all the way back. Got a new copper for the main cap nut, and a couple of 6mm bolts, and a new gasket. Can only go in one way. Obviously, it's off-centered. The bolt pattern slightly off-centered intentionally. So we're just going to walk over here and install it. We're at the rear cylinder head, so it's on the exhaust side. My wrench is still doing the work for me up there. As soon as I get this where I want it. Here's one of them. Let me grab the other bolt. Make sure I penetrate that gasket properly. And I'm just going to go ahead and start running it in. 6mm bolt. Typically 10 Newton meters. On these cam chain tensioners, they call out 12 Newton meters for the mounting bolts. I doubt my wrench is going to fit in here properly, but we'll see how it goes here. Might have to use one of those educated click wrenches. I'm barely in here, so Might want to look for a shorter Allen socket. We're going to finalize the rear cam chain tensioner. I've got my cap nut, my new copper. I'm going to load the spring right onto the bolt. Now, the trick is forcing all that up in there, allowing the tensioner to function, which I'm going to apply pressure by, you can hear that thing click off, and just apply a little pressure, make sure my threads are started properly, and they are. This cap bolt calls for a 20 Newton meter torque. Again, I don't believe I'm going to get a ratchet on there on this back one, so I'm just going to snug it for now and try to find a way later. So there you have it. Our tensioner is in place, the tension's applied properly, and if you come back over here, all said and done, this is what's important. Flywheel is on timing mark number 1. Intake cam, top dead center, and timing mark, same thing here, on the small marking on the cam. As you recall, when we were installing the cam chain tensioners, to achieve the proper torque, I ran into a couple of difficulties trying to fit my ratchet and wrench in there. Well, my brain cramp has now passed, and all it really takes is an extension. So, these two bolts are 12 Newton meter torque. This is 20. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this off for you. Here's that one. They even put this nice little cavity in there for me. I'm going to switch sockets. I believe it's a 19 millimeter. Bump my wrench up to 20. We're almost there. Hold on. And this fits right on there. And I was at that one. Now, as we talk about the front tensioner, the accessibility is much easier, and we'd already torqued this one off. But as you can see, the wrench fits in there good. And if I was using my Allen socket, it also fits in here good with no issues. So, just wanted to solve that dilemma for you. Wrapping up the cam installation and the timing and the tensioner of the rear cylinder head. There's one last item, and they ask that you install this last. And I believe the reason is the chain applies pressure to hold this against the internal side of the case so it properly lands in its receiver at the bottom. The top's easy, it's visual. So all we're going to do, take this cam chain guide, walk it down here, you'll feel it, and then just snap it in. That one's in, and this is actually ready for a valve cover. Just as we completed our rear cylinder bank timing, using top dead center timing mark number 1, the one we identified as red, we now have to move on to the timing mark for the front cylinder bank, which is timing mark 2. But one thing unique about a VMAX engine versus a lot of other engines, this is a 70-degree V4 type engine. You would think you just move 70 degrees and there's your top dead center mark. That's not true on a VMAX engine. You have to go 430 degrees. So what I did for the purpose of being able to control it, I put a breaker bar on here so that I don't have a ratchet where I lose track of where I'm at. Right now I'm at top dead center number 1, and you've already looked at it. My handle is approximately lined up with the timing mark, believe it or not. So I'm going to grab my cam chain, don't forget, this guy's loose up here. I'm going to hold on to it, keep some pressure on it so it don't bind or hang up. I'm going to make one complete revolution. Now, if I were to look in that window, I would see top dead center number 1 again. Now I'm going to go an additional 70 degrees. So what I'll do here, I'm going to go ahead and find my mark, line up on it, and then show it to you, and then we'll move on. So I've landed on my timing mark number 2, the black one. As you recall when we labeled the flywheel, red and black. Now we're on the black color code. I don't know if you'll pick it up or not, but it's there. It's directly across from the dart in the stator cover. I am now on timing mark number 2, which is 430 degrees from timing mark number 1. So that's 1 complete revolution plus 70 degrees. So here we go. We're at the front cylinder bank. We've located our timing mark, 430 degrees from top dead center of the rear bank. Can't stress that enough. I'm going to start throwing some camshafts in here. Now on the front bank, you want to load the exhaust cam first, because the exhaust cam is the one we have to keep the timing mark associated with. And again, I'm going to try to eyeball this and get it approximate. I got pretty lucky on the last one as far as the mesh point. I'm going to say one more tooth. I'm going to guess that that's a good spot for that one. And we'll check it again. I'm going to load the intake cam. And again, I'm just going to sneak it in here. I've pre-lubricated everything, as you can tell. And we'll try to land this puppy in here. Now, difference between the front and rear timing marks. Front set of cams use the large dot. Now we're at the large dot, not small dot on the rear, large dot on the front. I've highlighted them in black for your benefit. Well, I don't quite have this one in yet, but we're getting there. So we'll play with it a little bit and I'll get back with you. Front cylinder bank, like I said, we're on the black timing mark. Top dead center number 2, 430 degrees from top dead center number 1. I believe I'm very, very close here. So as you can see, I'm maintaining tension on the chain coming from the crankshaft across both cams. And there you have all timing marks lined up. So what I'm going to do is put in our caps number 2, E2, I2, the bridge. Here we are, got all of our caps in. Everything's loose installed and flushed out. Have our bridge in. All bolts have been lubricated. No Loctite, nothing else. Calls for 10 Newton meters. I'm going to just work this particular cam. I'm going to work from the center out. Everything's under tension here. I don't have the tensioner in, so I'm being gingerly here to make sure I don't cause it to skip across the sprockets. I have it right where I want it. So there you have it. We'll set up the tensioner and go from there. I didn't bore you with installing another cam chain tensioner, but as you can see, it's installed. We've torqued everything out. We're absolutely on our timing marks where we want to be. Everything's fleshed out, timing marks are there, tensioner's in. Last item to install, you got to remember this before you start rotating this engine, is the chain guide, cam chain guide. Now this one goes in the front, so you just slowly feed it down in there, snap it down in, and there you have it. We have all of our cams installed. We're timed. We believe we're timed correctly. Our tensioners are in place. So what I'm going to do now is roll the engine around a little bit, feel for any real hard spots. Now there's a difference between the lobe of the cam, and you're going to feel that resistance, and an actual hard hit. You want them to go nice and slow. Make sure the first couple of times around, make sure you got no hard hits. If you do, stop right there. We've got something wrong. So this feels pretty normal to me. I'm going to bring this back around to my black timing marks, and I'm just going to eyeball it in here. Take a quick look through my timing hole, and yes, I'm coming into timing mark number 2. So I'm happy with what I see there. I'm going to go do the same thing for timing mark number 1. And again, I'm just going to eyeball it up. Try to get it close. That looks really good. Check my flywheel. And I'm right there. So I'm properly timed, properly phased, and everything feels good as far as rotation. Here we are validating our bench shimming process. As you recall, when we were assembling the heads, we did do a bench shimming process, and I've gone through all the valves and everything looks good except for this pair right here. I seem to be a little tight right there, and I just wanted to share that with you and show you, just as we're going to install the Yamaha tool, show you how to change the shims while the cam and the shim buckets are assembled. So here's a 9 thousandths. I'm looking for 10, and as you can see, it's very tight. I can barely get the 9 in there, definitely not here. So we're going to go forward and set up the shim tool. We're ready to install our tool. This is what the typical tool looks like. You can look it up in the catalog. You can order it from a dealer. I highly recommend you get the one from Yamaha. I have purchased an aftermarket one. It's rather soft material. Don't really like it. Now, what I've done is rotated the engine to where the cams are now in this position, or the lobes are facing this edge right here. I've also positioned my shim buckets. As you can see, these little notches, they're 180 degrees apart. I'm putting one right here. I'm putting this one over here. I'm putting over here. Because what will happen is this tool is driven by this hex. As it rolls around, I'm anticipating it's going to take those two windows and draw them in to where I'll have access to pick the shims out. Now, the effort is just to hook it onto the shaft, just as you see it. Maintain center. I'm going to hold it on there. I'm going to start rolling my engine in normal direction first. And as I get closer, I'm going to verify that I'm between both shim buckets. And eventually, the lip of this tool will grab just the shim buckets. You don't want to land on top of the shim, just the shim bucket. And it's going to prematurely compress the buckets. And here we go. As you can see, the buckets are going down. And I'm going to stop right about there. Where we're at now is we have our tool installed. We've rotated the engine to where we've compressed just the buckets, not the shims. The shims ride with the buckets. And I was just going to show you these two tools. Small pair of hemostats. I'm using this prick tool with, it's got a goofy little end on it. It happens to be the one I like. You can use straight, whatever. Now, as we talked about those windows rolling to the center, I didn't quite get where I wanted to. But all I'm going to do is get under that shim and try to pop it off. And as you can see, that one came up. I'm going to reach in with my hemostat, grab that shim and pull it out. Now we know we were tight, so I'm going to look at my size, and it's a 255. So I'm going to set that one to the side. I'm going to pop this other one because they were both tight. I happen to be doing both at the same time. And again, just use the hemostats. Make sure you control the shim. And as I'm moving away from the cam chain galley, I have heard of guys dropping them down in there. This one happens to be a 262. So as you recall, we found both of these very tight. This one here had a shim size of 265 in it. I'm going to drop it down to a 260. I have my 260. Numbers on the back, number faces down. Give the next guy a running chance, the next guy that does your valves. And what I'll do is I'll try to position that in there. I've got my poker in there, and I'm just going to try to get it to land just like that on top of the shim bucket. Now I'm going to take a screwdriver and just try to snap it in and seat it. And there you go. You heard it snap in. So we'll move on to the next one. This valve. As you recall, it was tight also. It was a 262. I'm going to drop it to a 258. Numbers facing down. Like I said, give the next guy a chance. I'm just going to try to lay it in there, get it on top of that shim bucket, halfway started, and then I'll pop it in with my screwdriver. And again, you should be able to hear it snap. Well, that one did go down. So there you have it. And now what we'll do, I'm going to rotate backwards. And my starter's in and everything, so you're going to hear some funny noises, but that's okay, go slow. I'm going to rotate backwards to get my tool out of here. I'm looking for that tool to come out as soon as I can, because I don't like going backwards in great distances. Almost there. There, my tool's out. Now what I'll do is I'll go to the forward rotation. And what I'm going to try to do is seat, make sure those are seated. Just going forward, let the cam lobes apply pressure on those shims. I'm wiped all the way across. Now I stopped right there. I'm going to come back and forth. Go back and forth across that shim a little bit just to squirt out any lubricant that got under it, whatever. And there you have it. Gone ahead, changed both those shims using the Yamaha shim tool. And as you recall, the initial problem was a 9 thousandths wouldn't even pass through there. Well, see, my 9 goes through nice and easy. I like to use 10 and 11 as a no-go. So here's my 10, goes in, looks pretty good. Now I'm going to go to my 11. And as you can see, it will not pass. So that is one set of valves out of all of them that we had to make some adjustments after the installation from based on our bench shimming process. So not bad at all. Here we are wrapping up some more covers and closeouts. What I wanted to share with you here is the valve cover gasket. Got a pair of scissors. Scissors aren't just for opening the package, but we're going to use it to open it. Make sure I don't cut through nothing. But you're also going to need a pair of scissors or some type of a razor knife, because you're going to find that this comes to you with a little bridge in it. And there it is right there. Nice cute little thing. It's part of the way they mold it, process it, whatever. So what you want to do is cut that bridge out without cutting into the gasket. So there's one side. There's the other side. And you can just throw that away or chew on it. And what we'll do is we'll set it up in a cover. Point of interest I wanted to point out to you on installing the valve cover gasket. Install it onto the valve cover. If you look inside the casting, you will see an arrow. The arrow's pointing in that direction. If you look on the gasket, you'll see that little dart, that little arrow. You want them pointing in the same direction. That does not mean pointing to the front of the engine. That means pointing to the exhaust side. And you'll see that as we go to install the cover. What I like to do, and I'll get it prepped up before we go over, I'm going to put a little bit of that Yamabond in there, help hold, not for sealing purposes, because this is a very good gasket, but just to help hold the gasket in place, kind of tack it in place, so that once I flip it over, it isn't flip-flopping all over the place and while I'm trying to install the cover. Here we are. I have our valve cover, have the gasket installed. Like I said, I put a little trace of Yamabond in that groove side down, facing the cover, and that helps hold it as we're going to flip it over and attempt to install it. Again, don't know if you can pick that up. That arrow right there points towards the exhaust, and we're at the rear cylinder head, so it's going to point rear. Front one points forward, rear one points rear. So wish me luck here. Now what you want to do is just try to hold everything in position, walk it down on top. Don't worry about those little ears. And I'm going to just hand start 2 bolts just to be somewhat centered. I happen to be using a little bit different valve cover bolt here, preference again. And now's a good time to take a look at your gasket and these ends. I don't know if you can see this or not. These ends. Don't sink them in, just push them in flush. As you can see, I'm still floating around here because I only have 2 bolts in. So I'm going to go ahead and hand start all the bolts because the grommets will help center the valve cover. Alright, we're ready to wrap this up. So what we've done is set the cover on. I've hand started all the bolts, all the valve cover bolts, because the grommet helps center and position the valve cover. These are all just loose installed. A thing you're going to want to do before you torque this thing down, walk through, even with a flashlight. Sometimes I use a flashlight. I don't know what this is going to do, but walk through and verify that thing is in position 100% all the way around before you start torquing it down. Now going back to these flats right in here, you don't want to oversink them. Just flush them out just like that. No big deal. Valve cover bolts, they're all a shoulder bolt. So what they do is they compress the grommet and then they bottom out on the shoulder. So all we're going to do is bottom these out on the shoulder. I'm just going to use a crisscross pattern. 1, 2, 3, 4, we'll go 5, 6, 7, 8, something like that. And that's all you need to do, and these valve covers are installed. So if you click a few of these off here, and it's seating the grommet, which is, I happen to lubricate the grommets if they're used, adds a little more life to them. I could have went a little farther on that one. And we're just about there. So what we'll do, 6 Newton meters, I'm sorry, it's a 6 millimeter bolt, 10 Newton meters. There you go. You don't want to over torque these or you'll snap them off right in those cam caps, because it is a shoulder bolt. What we have here is one of 4 cylinder coolant covers, and behind that cover is just a simple little plug. And there's the part number for it if you happen to need to look it up. And it's as simple as just installing it on the end of a spark plug. You were probably wondering why the spark plug was there. And then you also use the spark plug to remove the old one. So what I've done is I prepped this new one, put a little bit of oil on it. Again, rubber likes petroleum, so we're going to go there. We'll walk over to the block and install one for you. Here we are at the engine. This is one of 4 drain points at the base of each cylinder jug. As you can see, there is one over here. I've already buttoned it up. We're going to go after this one. You do 1, you can do 4. They're all the same. Here's our plug. And the plug is installed on the end of a spark plug. And this is a good use for your old spark plugs to install them and or remove them. You just thread it in there and pull it out, or do like I did for an installation. Point I wanted to make here on the cover itself, the cover, there's your typical cover. This is the top, this is the bottom. But if you look, there's a relief point. There's a machine shoulder in here, and that's intentional. So what I'm going to do is stick my bolt through here, locate it, just going to loose install it. Now what I want to do is square it to the bottom of the head and make sure it's flush on both sides, because there's a little bit of play in this, a little bit of slop, and crank it down. Well, here we are with the oil delivery system. As you can see, it's a lot of associated hardware. Almost looks like a plumber works for Yamaha. What we're going to do is we're going to install our O-rings, all new O-rings. O-rings on the delivery manifold, the feed and return tubes, etc., and so on. Got our fasteners ready, got our dowel pins ready. One point I wanted to make, brand new oil pump. You've gone through a lot of effort and a lot of expense savings by doing a lot of this work yourself. Don't cut this corner. Always put in a new oil pump. You got brand new bearings in there, put in a brand new oil pump. Here we are at the block, getting ready to install all of our oil delivery system. I've installed the 2 dowel pins. The oil pump takes 2 dowel pins. Next thing you need to pay attention to is the position of this counterweight on the crankshaft. I purposely have it flat like that because we are going to be installing a grommet and an oil delivery tube in this opening right here. So I like to do that first. Here's the piece. Got this silly little grommet on it, off center. Mounting flange up, long side down. And all we're going to do is take it, set it in there. I'm going to loose lay it just like that. We got a lot of hardware to go in. So the next thing we're going to do, if you recall, way back when we were doing our case bolts, I told you leave 1 bolt loose. Leave it loose. This is the bolt, and this is why. We're going to take our main delivery system. I'm going to install this right inside here. It's got a lead in on it. You want to go nice and easy. Don't tear up your new O-ring. And we're going to take this puppy and stab it down. Line up all 4 points. Now I'm going to extend this out. It's on a slip fit. And extend this out so everything lines up. And there you go, just like that. So here it is, right here. Here's that gland coming off this tube. Here's that extra long bolt. I'm going to throw it in there. I'll put a few turns on it. Again, just so the bolt don't fall out, and we'll come back and torque it. Now we can go ahead and torque that. So just wanted to give you an opportunity to see why we left it loose and its purpose. That penetrates an oil galley. This is going to be a delivery for that oil galley. Here we are. You've seen the functionality of this bolt, and we'll come back and torque it. Main header system. Now we have 2 hold down points. But before we can install the fasteners for that, we have this drain tube. This drain tube is part of the return, oil return, coming back out of that main breather housing, I believe. So that just sets and overlays on top of this manifold bracket. So now I'm going to grab the 6mm, it's a hex head. I've dressed it with red Loctite. And I'm going to hold on to this just like this. This is not the time you want to be dropping a bolt or having a problem. It will make for a bad day. So I've just got that one hand started. I'm going to grab the second one. And we'll come back after everything's assembled and perform all of our torque settings. Keep in mind, this guy's still floating out there. We just want that puppy to float right there. So now, I'll go ahead, get our brand new oil pump. We have our dowel pins in. And what you want to pay attention to here is you got to kind of make two stabs at the same time. So we're going to install this delivery tube. That's all it is. It's on a slip fit. As you can see, obviously it's going to line up with this port in the block. Now, this is where the fun begins. We're going to try, I'll try to keep my hands out of your way. We're going to try to install this tube and the pump all at the same time. So I've started, as you can see, I've started this tube into that opening, and I've brought its mounting bracket right over the top. Meanwhile, I'm trying to maintain this position, all coupled with trying to hit the dowel pins. And we are real close, almost there. And that's looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and throw some of the fasteners in and draw down the oil pump. I've switched to a socket head Allen, and again, these fasteners are prepped, red Loctite, my preference. I didn't even look at the manual to tell you if you're supposed to do it or not. It's inside the engine. I'm doing it. I'm obviously not fully seated on my dowel pin, so I want to be gentle here. Draw it down slow. Now this third fastener is going to grab that bracket of that tube, go through the mount of the oil pump and into the block. So as you can see, there's a lot of hardware here associated with this oil pump and delivery system. I'm just slowly pulling this down. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Let it come down on top of those dowels. You can hear it seating. If I could seat that wrench. So there you have it. We have our pump installed. We have our pump delivers oil to the filter system, through the filter system, back to this header, filtered oiled here. It's distributed across all the main bearing journals, and back to that one oil galley, which takes care of a few other circuits for us. And we have the additional circuit over here. It's a secondary circuit to deliver oil into the stator area and or starter clutch area. All of our hardware is mounted, everything's stabbed and seated as it should be. We've snugged our oil pump down. One point of interest I wanted to make, I should have made note of it while we were installing the pump. I also want to make sure that that drive gear meshes properly, and this one did. And you can see there's a little bit of lash in it, and that's all part of that intermediate gear train. So we'll start with our torque pattern. Oil pump, 6mm bolts, 10 Newton meters. So I have my wrench set for 10 Newton meters. We're just going to start right here. There's only 3 of them. Okay, now I'm going to switch to a 10mm socket for those 2 fasteners, those hex fasteners. And it calls for 12 Newton meters because they are flange type. So you bump it up just a little bit. Keep in mind, our drain tube is stacked on top of this bolt here. So here we go. Now we're at 12 Newton meters. Now this is a good time to check this. I know it's a little difficult to see with all this hardware in the way, but this tube here, make sure that we're seated into our opening pointing towards the stator. Everything looks good there. So the last bolt to do, and you don't want to forget about it, was bolt 20, I believe, and it gets a 24 Newton meters. So bear with me here a second, and I'll set up to 24. Okay, I've got it. Now what I like to do on this bolt, and we'll point out to it, because of the type of collared copper gasket it has, a top and bottom on it, it wraps around the thing, it's got a little hard stop here, it's going to run itself into the side of the block. I also put a little bit of grease. I smear a little bit of grease on this one, because it tends to want to tear them up as we're torquing it down. I'm just going to, it's a long throated bolt. Trying to get it down here for you. Getting close. And here we are at torque. So what we've done is completely installed the oil delivery system. And one last note I want you to pay particular attention to, and I'll go get the wrench to roll this crankshaft over. Everything here looks good. It's installed right. I can see my grommets flush with the housing. I'm going to roll this crankshaft over just to make sure I have the clearance I'm looking for around that last tube. And here we go. And as you can see, there's a good 20-25 mils of clearance there. And I'm satisfied with that. One last note. Good thing I spotted this before I turn the camera on. These two hex fasteners, this one and this one, there's a tab. This tab, now that we have them installed and we have it torqued, you're to take this tab and place it center over the hex. This is just in case this bolt were to come loose. It's a safety feature they put in. If either of these bolts were to come loose, there's no way they can fall out and get caught up and tangled up in your engine. So make sure you don't forget about those two tabs. Well, here we are buttoning up some more covers. Obviously we have our oil pan gasket. Have this grommet. It's a very important piece. I'll cut it open. We'll talk about it in a minute. That's a very important piece. You want to make sure you get a new one of those. And then all I got over here is the bolts that hold the oil pan down, a couple of dowel pins, and the two bolts for the low oil level sensor. In addition, I have a pressure gauge set here and also a new plug, magnetic plug, drain plug. And so what we'll do is go through most of this and prep it all up, and we'll start the installation. But before we do that, I wanted to show you this. As simple as this is a very important piece to your oil lubrication system. This is the grommet, and you'll see it as we install it. This is the grommet that's going to snap over one of the oil delivery tubes, and it functions as a cushion or as a push-off. The oil pan forces down on that to maintain the seating of that delivery tube. Another thing on the oil pan here, let's cover a couple items while we're here. You want to make sure this little spill pot's in place. That's one of those drains that comes down, goes in here, just keeps it from the oil from slinging and getting caught up and everything else. You got this little bracket in here, and that's really all the components. Pay attention to these two pads and this area right here. That's where this grommet, I'm going to just set it in here. You can imagine that, just like that. But it's going to be installed on the other piece. So as we draw this up, it's going to apply pressure to that fill tube. These two pads right here apply pressure to that main oil header, so it doesn't pop out under high pressure. And it keeps everything seated and all your O-rings seated. And this is just some little separator. Our drain plug's down in here, and we'll go from there. Here we are, back at the engine, ready to close out another panel, put another cover on. So what I've done is I've installed the gasket. I've put my dowel pins in place. This is your last opportunity to go back and check everything. Check your torque on bolt 22. Make sure your tabs are centered over your hex hold down bolts for your oil manifold. Make sure you're seated in your delivery tubes. And right here, that's that grommet. That's that piece I just showed you. I took and elected to put a little smudge of even Yamabond on the inside of it and just smash it down on top of there. Replace that grommet, because as that dries out and spreads out, it's less pressure being applied to keep that O-ring in its journal or in its port. You also have these two rubber pads, which we talked about earlier, where how the oil pan itself applies pressure here, here, and here to hold this oil system in place while it's under high pressure. So here we go. We're just going to drop the cover on. Like I said, the dowels are in place. I'm comfortable that we've got everything where it needs to be. And get this to line up a little bit. Go from there. Now all the bolts, there's 12 of them. They're all the same length. So I'm going to go ahead and put these in, flush them out. We'll run through a quick little torque pattern and go from there. Oil pan's in place. All the bolts are in. 12 fasteners, 6 millimeter, 10 newton meters. Just going to use a crisscross pattern. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And we'll go from there. Oil pan's in, torqued out. Next is our oil low level detection. This is not an oil level gauge. It's just a detection. Low oil or greater than low oil. It's just kind of an on-off type thing. All you do is start it down in here, snap it past that O-ring. Now I'm going to take the routing a little bit. There's a little tab that's going to go in here. I'll show you that when we go through the wiring dress out. I'm just checking myself here. Looks good. I'm going to throw that over there. 2 screws. They're shorter than the ones used on the oil pan itself. It is a blind hole. You don't want to overdo it and put too long of a bolt in. And again, it's just a matter of running them down. 6 millimeter, 10 newton meters of torque. Another area we can't forget about, you have to close up this oil galley. This is your main oil galley. So if you're using a stock setup, you've got a plug similar to this, got an O-ring on the back, just a matter of, it's a straight thread, just a matter of starting it in there and running it in and torquing it out. In my particular case, I happen to like to use an oil pressure gauge. So I got a little aftermarket kit. First piece is an adapter with a good heavy gasket on it, nice gasket on it. And we're going to put that in. I prepped that thread with Teflon. And then I'm just going to run it in. The reason I like to have an oil pressure gauge, when the engine starts up and we're testing it, I'll be able to see how everything's performing. And then on my personal bikes, I like to have it. It kind of tells me when things are warmed up, so I'm not taking off in high pressure. Fluid-filled gauge. I'm going to go ahead and start it on here once I get the thread to catch. It might be today. Well, I'll take the meter off, take the gauge off, and see if I can have any luck with it like that. There we go. That brass, you don't want to force it. Another neat thing about these kits, everything's metric. So basically, I'm not going for a bar mount or a water pump mount, just something I can glance at when I'm tuning the bike and or waiting for it to warm up. So I'm going to clock this approximately right here. Of course, we're working upside down, but it's the best way to show you. And then I'm going to put my gauge in, torque it up, or not torque it off, just set it. It's all tapered threads. You have to use some good judgment here. Again, keeping in mind it's brass. That's getting pretty good. So the next time I have the engine rolled over, I'll clock that meter to where it's pointing straight up. You pretty much got the method of operation as we go on here, as we're getting close to the end. So what I did is I threw in the oil delivery system that comes up through the breather housing, feeds both cylinder heads. All you got to keep in mind, new copper, new copper, new copper, new copper, new copper, new copper. Always put in new copper. You've done a lot of work on this engine for the 20, 30 cents these things cost. Don't hold back. Another point of interest. Because I'm working in this area, I decided to tape off my intake ports just in case I drop something or whatever. So where we're at is you want to bring this kind of down. It's all hand started. Bring it down, bring them in, get everything lined up, get everything in place before you start torquing. So these two, banjo bolts require 18 Newton meters of torque, so I'm just going to go ahead and finish them off here for you. And that copper's soft, you can feel it drawn in. There's that one. Come over here and get this one. The large banjo bolt takes 20 Newton meters. So I'm going to bump myself up here, 20 Newton meters, switch sockets, and we'll have this wrapped up for you. So here we go. And there we have it. So again, everything inside of here looks to be ready. We're going to go ahead and install the starter. Just a typical VMAX starter, nothing special about it. Take a good look at your O-ring, make sure you make your own determination if you need to change it or not. I elected to change this one. One thing I like to do, being that the block was painted, I go ahead and scrape the paint off this mounting surface, and also the back side of the starter, for the purpose of having a pressure connection to ground versus the slip fit of the collar. You will get some grounding properties out of that, but not as good as you will out of a pressure fitting. So, to install it, just as simple as it looks. So, gotta line it up with the opening. You might have to fiddle with a little bit to get your gear alignment, and then just slide it in. Now I'm going to back it out just a little bit because I find that it likes to be out just a little bit. To see this amount of exposure is very normal, so ignore that. That's just the way they have it set up. For mounting, you got a long and a short bolt. That's all it is. Long bolt in the top, short bolt in the bottom. I'm going to run these in and I'll get a torque set up and we'll go from there. As you can see, everything's in place. It's been flushed out. All I'm going to do is click this off at 10 Newton meters, two 6mm bolts. There's one. And there's the other one. So there you have it. Starter's installed. When we do our wiring, we'll be coming back for the connection point. Okay, here we are. I believe we're down to our last cover. It's been a long haul here, and we've covered a lot of ground. So what we got is a stator tuning fork emblem. That's the one with the half cut in it. Goes around the timing mark opening. Here's our closeout screw for the timing mark opening. Pay attention to the back side of that. It has an O-ring on it. And while we're talking about O-rings, I have an O-ring on the back of the tuning fork emblem. It does function as a seal, and it will leak if it's bad. Then we have this rubber grommet. Grommet has no sealing properties, but it does go behind the tuning fork emblem in order to prevent a hard metal-to-metal itch between the emblem and the stator housing. We have a compression washer, and you're going to see how that goes in, along with a couple of fasteners. I've installed that grommet that we talked about. There's three little points that it snaps onto, here, here, and here, right on the stator cover. Next thing we want to do is install this compression washer. There's a shoulder to it. That shoulder faces in towards the bolt. And then as you can see, these two little bevels will function as a deflector or pressure point. So just drop that in just like that. Should look just like that. We have our tuning fork emblem, O-rings on the back. Make sure you got that. Now you want to be aware of your mounting points to kind of line everything up. You will be able to rotate it if you need to. So I'm going to just guess at it. Something like that. Looks like I'm close. We'll find out when we go to put the bolts in. So that looks good. Just a couple of fasteners. I'm not going to overdo it here. It is mounted in rubber. Okay, so we have our tuning fork cover in. We're secured. Now we're going to go after the timing window. We've got to close up that timing window. So it's just a matter of reinstalling the plug back in. I use a little pair of aviation screwdrivers here, only because I have them laying around. I'm just going to finish it off with the screwdriver. O-rings on the back. I've already checked it. Don't want to overcrank it. That's all it needs. Just like that. We have mechanically finished this engine. Well, here we are on the home stretch of this project. Just wanted to talk a little bit about the wiring harness and the routing. So what I generally do is I use the starter cable as a master because it's the stiffest. So as you can see, it's just connected at the starter, typical. Stay close to the block. You want to stay close to the block in the oil pan this way because you do have an exhaust pipe coming through here. At this point, you're going to pick up your low oil level detection wire. I've got this bracket on there. There's another, the stock bracket's a little smaller, but I couldn't find mine, so I made one. No big deal. Just captures it. You'll see the passage underneath there. That's part of the oil pan. I come down through here. I dart under this part of the stator housing. And at this point, right in here, I pick up the stator cables, and I also pick up the trigger cables, or for the pickup coils, in addition to the neutral cable, neutral switch cable. And just route them nice and tight. Go through this bracket. Now this bracket, you got to be careful because you want to make sure you got clearance. You got to see daylight under there when you're all said and done between the shaft and the bracket so that you're not binding on your shifter shaft or causing any resistance there. And then just on down and ready to go into your bike. Now I elected to use spiral wrap. It works well for me. Kind of dresses things out and allows you to tuck it away and hide everything and keeps everything nice and neat for you. The only other cable you got to be concerned with is a ground cable. Ground cable comes off the outboard side of the screw right next to the oil fill cap. Another area you're going to want to scrape the paint. Make sure you got a good ground and just get your ground cable ready. And other than rolling this engine over, it's ready to go on a bike. Well, that was quite a journey. I hope you found this entertaining and it proves to be beneficial while aiding you in the assembly of your VMAX engine. There's nothing more satisfying than owning a VMAX with an engine that you built with your own hands. I'd like to extend my thanks for your invested time and interest.